Hello and welcome to the annual TRT World Forum 2021 and for joining our third expert roundtable, The Taliban Returns, Lessons Learned and Lost. As we note in our booklet, the global landscape has changed dramatically in the 20 years since the 9/11 attacks and the US declaration of a global war on terror. The first battle of that war was the invasion of Afghanistan to kill or capture those responsible for the attacks and their Taliban hosts. Yet after that mission was completed, the US did not leave. There was a steady mission creep to create self-sufficient Afghan security forces, a democratically elected government, rights and education for women, and a list of other impressive nation-building objectives. Some were successful, most were left unfinished, and it is likely none will prove self-sustaining. By 2020, Americans were tired, impatient, and overcome with mission fatigue. Few countries, least of all the United States, could justify a long-term foreign presence equal to that in Germany, Japan, or Korea. As in Vietnam, Americans were seeking an honorable exit. What they got was cut and run. By way of introduction, I am Tanya Goudsouzian, head of interviews at TRT World. I've written about Afghanistan for the past 20 years and remain fascinated by the country, its people, its past, and now its future. Alongside me today are a distinguished panel of speakers and discussants, all of them experts and prominent names in the discourse on Afghanistan. Mohammad Daoud Abedi is head of the Afghan National Peace Council for the Taliban. He joins us from Los Angeles. Saad Mohseni is director of the Mobi Group, which includes, among other media outlets, Tolo TV, arguably the most watched television channel in Afghanistan. Sultan Barakat is a director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha, Qatar, an honorary professor at University of York. He's been at the center of mediation efforts for both the US Taliban talks in Doha, as well as the intra-Afghan talks. Dr. Barnett Rubin is senior fellow at the Center on International Cooperation and author of numerous books on Afghanistan, South and Central Asia. He has also served as the senior advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the US State Department. Later on, we'll be joined by Shukriya Barakzai, an Afghan politician, former member of parliament and former ambassador of Afghanistan to Oslo. The ground rules for today include 5 to 8 minutes for remarks from each speaker. Then we'll be joined by an impressive group of discussants for short interventions. I'll introduce them later. With our remaining time, we will start taking questions. As always, please keep your microphone on mute unless you are speaking. And speakers and discussants, do send me a message in the chat box if you wish to ask a question or raise your hand. Mr. Abedi, let's start with you. I think he's on mute.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. First of all, I welcome every distinguished guest and yourself into the program, and I appreciate the time. I am familiar with Mr. Rubin. We have met my honorable brother, Sultan Barakat. We have met in Qatar many times, and I'm glad to see them once again. I must say that the new developments in Afghanistan surprised everybody. After 20 years of war in Afghanistan, we were all hoping that there will be a smooth transfer of the power to probably a third interim government or caretaker government, but unfortunately that didn't happen, and we saw what happened after that. Within this 2 years, as Mr. Barakat is a witness to this, I personally attended Qatar and met with Foreign Ministry of Qatar, the Taliban, and Brother Barakat. And as well as Mr. Rubin, we met in the United Nations and also in his office. Continuously, we said that there should be an intermediary Afghan group that assist the peace process. And that was due to the Afghan culture and Afghan religious beliefs and all that that should be advising the negotiation teams. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Even though one time we kind of set it up, that intermediate Afghan group that to hold Afghan-led and Afghan talks, but unfortunately, the name was Afghan-led and Afghan-owned, but no Afghans had any influential role in it. It was all the other countries talking about Afghanistan without Afghans, and this is what the result is. What we saw in the past 20 years under the name of democracy, unfortunately, we saw that there was no democracy in Afghanistan, and nobody took into consideration the beliefs and the political complexity of Afghanistan, neither the geopolitical complexity of Afghanistan. A lack of effective team, lack of understanding of the people, lack of understanding of the economic needs in Afghanistan and the culture and all of that led to this situation that we are. While we are happy that a corrupt government is no longer there, there's the Emirat of Islamic of Afghanistan, after 43 years of war in Afghanistan, at least we have a chance not to get killed. As the whole world is aware that in the past 43 years, a minimum 200 to 300 Afghans used to get killed and another 300, 400, 500 used to get wounded. At least that part of the war is ended. Now it's time to rebuild Afghanistan. Unfortunately, with all these problems that Afghanistan is facing today, including sanctions, we are going toward miserable lives for Afghanistan, for Afghans. Afghans are being under pressure right now. As you can see this morning, Tolo News was announcing that in Ghor, a lady was selling two of her children. And this is due to this situation. The suggestion would be that what are we going to do from here on? Are we going to punish the Afghan people just to take revenge from the Taliban? The US never went to Afghanistan to do nation building. That was not the purpose. The reason that they came out also was not that the US was militarily defeated. That was not either the issue. Both administrations, Trump and Mr. Biden, asked the military generals that three questions: that how much more time are we going to be there? How much more money are we going to invest? And what are the circumstances and situations that we are going to expect from Afghanistan? Neither of these questions were answered properly to the administration. On the other hand, the US administration is facing challenges from very progressive policies, economic policies, and military policies of China toward Taiwan and other parts of the world. And the expansionism of Russia is also worrying the United States. The Iran, the nuclear issue with North Korea, all of these issues are attracting a lot of attention of the US administration. And the US didn't want to be bogged down while Russia, China, and some other peoples would have loved the United States to stay engaged and just be bogged down and keep fighting another 10 years, which would have given them the opportunity to do whatever they wanted to do. Therefore, it was the right time to pull out. I totally agree with that. But I wish the progress of the negotiation would have been handled in a different manner, a little bit different, with Afghans more involved in it. So that way we could have a better result of not seeing people running through the runways to get in the US plane. That is what is saddening us, and that's what we hope that we could correct. Now the policy from here on should be working with the Islamic Emirat of Afghanistan to solve the problem and hopefully have a better Afghanistan which is free of terrorism, with being a peaceful policies toward the foreign international community, working with the neighbors and all that.
Mr. Abedi, thank you. Thank you for your observations. Saad Mohseni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to see all my old friends, at least on the screen, and good to be joining you. I think the focus really should be on the country itself, the people, and its future. I know that there is, especially in the U.S. media, various postmortems as to why this transpired and why it happened. I think, and continued discussion about getting people out, SIVs or other people associated with Western powers. It actually pains me to not have more discussion on the fate of the 38 million people who remain inside the country. I think what I want to take a step back and firstly talk about the Afghanistan of 2021 as compared to the Afghanistan that was last ruled by the Taliban. Its population has almost doubled from 21 odd million to about 38 million. The vast majority of which are under the age of 22 or 23. Something like 65% of the population has never experienced, or they were too young to have experienced the Taliban type rule. They are much better educated than the rest of the population. We think if you look at the under 25, something like 75% of the population is educated, is literate. You have a population that's aspirational, that has ambitions, that is looking forward to the future, or has been for at least the last 2 decades, and a country that got accustomed to a certain standard of living, and that very much has been taken away from them. Of the $8.5–9 billion that went into Afghanistan today, it's difficult to see who's going to fill that vacuum. And in addition to the economic and humanitarian crises facing the country, we have this economic crisis that could really drag the country down. Something like 95% of the population could be under the poverty line. These concerns of these issues are not addressed quickly. So what to do? I think engaging is probably the most important thing that the world can do. Neglecting and forgetting Afghanistan should not be an option. It was actually disappointing to see the Americans not participating in the Troika meeting in Moscow. That's yet another sign, an unfortunate one, that the Americans are not that intent or that keen to engage with Afghanistan or with the region vis-a-vis Afghanistan. With Khalilzad leaving, the other panelists may also have their own opinions, but I just think the elevation of Tom West, who's not really the most senior diplomat, to take over from Ambassador Khalilzad is not necessarily the sort of news we were looking for. We had assumed that someone more senior would take over, someone with access to the White House or to the president and the senior leadership and the US government. But I think the most important thing the Americans can do is, to have a policy beyond getting translators and other individuals out of the country. What is their longer term strategy for Afghanistan? How do they aim to assist the country and its people? And for them to be able to achieve that, they need to engage at some level with the Taliban in Kabul. The Taliban, their victory was absolute. They control the country today. And in order to help the country and its people, they have to engage with the Taliban. I think that's really important. And engaging doesn't necessarily mean recognition. It just means that they're in a position to A, understand the Taliban, B, to be able to communicate to them as to what they need to do in order to secure full recognition, which may come in 12 months or 18 months or 2 years or in 5 years, but also to be able to assist on the ground, to have their NGOs, to have their fulfillment partners work inside the country. I think that's really important. The other thing which is important, just as important, is engaging the region, whether it's the Chinese, Pakistanis, or Russians, or or members of the GCC, in particular the Qataris. They need to be able to have that dialogue. So pretty much the world is on the same page in terms of how to approach the Taliban. Thirdly, I think it's important for pretty much everyone to figure out how to become relevant again. What leverage do they have? How they can be of assistance, and what is it that they can offer in return for more moderate policies or more, more inclusive government, for example. Last but not least, it's people look at Afghanistan as a complete failure. I don't agree with that. I think over the last 20 years, the country has changed tremendously. You have this younger population that's educated. You have life expectancy that's rose by 50%. Child mortality has dropped. You have a population that's connected. People watch television. People are engaged on mobile phones. Hundreds of thousands of people are engaged in the private sector. There's been huge amounts of infrastructure built over the last 20 years. Literacy has gone up. Free expression. Afghanistan is one of the freest countries, even today, in the entire region. There's access to clean water, health services. So I think it's important that we not necessarily walk away from these gains. And the world has an obligation to help Afghanistan navigate this very difficult period, so these gains are not necessarily thrown away. And I agree with my compatriot that engaging is important, talking is important, and I know the Americans are bitter about what's transpired, but disengaging, I think, is more dangerous than engaging. Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. Thank you for that. Moving on to Sultan Barakat.
Hello, Tanya. Good to join you, and very good to see all old friends in this session. If you allow me, I will just make a few points. The first one, I think that although the last few days leading to the 15th of August came as a surprise in terms of the speed of change and the failure of the state to hold its position, I think the writing was on the wall for a long time. And I think there has been a fundamental problem, particularly on the side of the Republicans within Afghanistan, in accepting the fact that the United States have, in fact, changed its priorities vis-a-vis Afghanistan. They have woken up to the fact that they've been dragged into a nation-state building exercise that was beyond their original mission, that has become extremely expensive, both in terms of dollars and people being killed or soldiers being killed. And the real change started back in 2014, when the major reduction of forces took place and the change of mission happened, and the Americans took the back stage and pushed the Afghan army to fight the Taliban. Now, that mere fact, and in fact, actually, the Biden himself and the role he played under Obama has been totally misunderstood, I think, by some politicians on the Republican side, partly because they just refused to believe that this is going to happen. And there was a continuous belief that they can somehow convince or engage the US in an operation which has become very much aligned with a lot of vested interest among some senior politicians and some large sort of businessmen and private sector who are living on fueling the war and so on. Now, that is an important thing to me to start to discussion with, so that we put it into perspective. I don't think it is sufficient to claim that the Americans suddenly have decided to flee the country and they've cut short and they moved on. The second point, in terms of the United States, I understand that their priorities have changed, and I understand that they're now maybe more focused on containing China in the Pacific, and they don't see Afghanistan as central to their role in Asia as it used to be the case. But they also, I think, see it as a way maybe to add to the burden of China, that by them pulling out and leaving the responsibility of countering terrorism and securing the region onto China, maybe that is a way that keeps the Chinese somehow busy elsewhere. And that is something that we started to see a little bit more and more of. The second point is related to the Taliban themselves. I genuinely believe that there has been a fundamental change in the way the movement considers politics. Back in 1996, they may have come to power by coincidence. You know, the ruling of Afghanistan was not the objective. They found themselves suddenly in the ruling seat, and they've had to play catch up with politics, with the international relations and so on. And obviously, like everyone knows, they struggled badly, and then came 9/11. Now I think the situation is slightly different. They seem to be determined to come back to rule, either exclusively or in an inclusive way, but they are determined to be part of a government that is going to be sustained. And to me, I think that is a good point, and it's an opening for further investment in terms of how and to what extent can the world engage them and help them adjust their way of doing things so that to the benefit of the 38 million Afghan people. We, like everybody else, were taken back by how peaceful the transition happened. I know maybe for people who are on the ground and the fear that was in Kabul and the rush to the airport, everything else, they may think this is an odd comment to make, but in overall, this last 2 months, there has been a major reduction of violence in Afghanistan. And then for the first time in a long time, the whole country is under one authority, which is interesting. I have friends who started now writing to me saying they've been to the countryside for the first time in a long time to visit villages and to enjoy sites around the country. People are traveling from one place to the other. Things are moving back to a situation where stability and security is the rule. Now, I think the world has as a choice here. Either we accept that these are important, fundamental, contextual issues that have to be there in order for the government of Afghanistan and the rest of the world to invest in education, health, human rights, everything else, or we all wait and see and expect them to change and meet a very high level of demands without engaging directly. And I think if we choose the latter, the chances of them not succeeding is high, partly because of the lack of capacity amongst the ranks of the movement, but partly also because the way they may go about forcing or enforcing security, they may use methods that are not to our liking and not to our ability to accept or to even consider. I think if the situation of security deteriorates to further in certain parts, and we start seeing the Taliban going back to hanging people in the streets or chopping off hands, well, this is the sort of thing that no one in the world would like to see coming back to Afghanistan. And as such, we need to consider very carefully, not just from a humanitarian perspective, and I understand the humanitarian is very important, humanitarian assistance is required, but it is not required in the same way as it was back in the 1990s, and it's not required in the same way as it is now required in a post-disaster context. We do have institutions that have survived. We have thousands of civil servants that have been trained, that are on the job. You have systems, although they're not perfect, but they were working in education and health, that should really be helped to continue. Now, if we rely on humanitarian assistance in its pure definition of saving lives, I think that would be a huge mistake. I think what is required in Afghanistan now is an engagement that leads to a humanitarian plus or some kind of arrangement that allows the humanitarian assistance to be done almost with two eyes, one on the humanitarian saving life concern and one on the longer term developmental concern. And this is, to my mind, is important because the vast majority of the people are still in the country. And the vast majority of the people have had the experience and benefited from the 20 years of investment that went in the country. And would be a real shame to ignore all of that and to keep focus on the small number of people who either are seeking power at the moment or the discussion that we keep hearing about 120,000 being evacuated, and these are the skillful people in Afghanistan, and as such now there's no one to manage anything in the country, and we have to bring in expertise and support them from outside. So I think there is a requirement to revisit the concept of humanitarian assistance in that context. The other point which is important to acknowledge is the business of corruption. Corruption, not just in terms of attempting to keep the US involved, but corruption in general has, as you know, become almost a subculture. And one positive aspect of what the Taliban are promising is that they will put an end to this. Now, I'm not sure if they would be capable of doing that, and I'm not sure if power will not corrupt. And the moment they start engaging in the basics of life, from supplying fuels to food to all sorts of things, I think avenues and possibilities of corruption will open up. But so far, what we have learned is that they are attempting to counter this. And I have read recent reports that they've discovered thousands of ghost jobs in the civil service. They've discovered thousands of ghost soldiers in the military that were on the payroll, but they did not exist in reality. And if this continues, then it is to the benefit of the people of Afghanistan, it is to the benefit of the region, it's to the benefit of the security of Afghanistan and to the world. And the final point, I think, in terms of sanctions and freezing resources. I mean, clearly, if we were to think objectively for a minute, I mean, the resources that were frozen were not Taliban resources. They were resources raised under the previous government. It's Afghan people's money. And I think it is up to the Afghans to decide how it's going to be spent and invested and so on. But what is happening, which is interesting, is not now there's a call within the US to compensate the victims of 9/11. Through courts by having a claim on some of these billions that have been put aside. And this brings us back to the situation that existed with Sudan for many, many years, where the US frozen its assets, and then little by little they were chipping off it through court cases, individuals who were affected by the 1991 bombings in Africa. Now, it's not to say that people do not deserve compensation, but if you're going to compensate Americans who lost their life in 9/11, you may as well compensate as well Afghans who lost their life as a result of 9/11 later on. But that has not been discussed. And unfortunately, we all know that at the end, it is somehow resolved by politics, but by the time it is done, time has passed and a lot of problems would have developed and a lot of obstacles would have emerged, which makes us lose whatever little opportunity exists at the moment. And we're all aware of the rise of Daesh and potentially maybe an insurgence that is going to rise inevitably to try and counter some of the Taliban advance. And all of this will put more and more pressure on the system. And from a people's point of view, I think it will again shift the priority of the Taliban government from day-to-day governance and priorities and development to do what they probably are best at, and that is fighting and security and so on, and drag the country yet again into this security zone discussion, where millions of dollars, lots of people will be lost, still seeking security. And I think that would be quite a loss to Afghanistan and to the region. I think I'll stop here and then we can come back in the discussion. Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, Sultan. We'll finish the speaker session hearing from Dr. Barnett Rubin.
Thank you, Tanya. And like what everyone else said, it's very good to see all my friends up here on camera. I'd like to echo a lot of the things that they've said. I'll try not to repeat them. But first of all, let me repeat something, which is that as unpleasant as it is, the Taliban are now the government of Afghanistan. And there is no alternative to the Taliban as government of Afghanistan at the moment. Let me explain what I mean by that. It isn't true, as Saad said, that the previous regime disappeared, the Islamic Republic disappeared with no legacy. It left a huge legacy, but it did not leave much of a political legacy. That is, one of the striking things about it is that there are no really nationally functioning political parties that came out of the Islamic Republic. And for that, I don't know who to fault except the leaders, but the leaders were responding to the type of incentives they had, which was to get resources. You had to please the foreigners, and mobilizing Afghans really did not have much effect on what you could do. So there's that kind of political vacuum, which I will come back to. And of course, the security institutions largely crumble. Which is one thing that everyone was focused on trying to avoid. And that was, in fact, the main reason that they were trying, even to the last minute, to have some kind of negotiated transition of power. And well, I won't go into the reasons that all of that happened. A lot of people have analyzed it and so on. But it means that we now have a society that has changed tremendously with higher levels of education, social connectivity, internet, which will remain as long as there's electricity, which will not remain if no one pays the bills for the electricity, which is imported from Uzbekistan and Iran primarily, and infrastructure and expectations and so on. And below the leadership level, a lot of the institutions of government that are most visible actually have been reformed and improved to some extent. But at the top level, you have a very narrow Taliban government, which disappointed everyone. It really violated the what the Taliban themselves had promised, an inclusive government. It's inclusive in one sense. It's not. It's actually, I was going to say it's inclusive in the sense that it includes all the factions of the Taliban. But I actually, let me step back. It does not really have a good balance among all the factions of the Taliban, let alone the rest of the Afghan population, which is not represented at all. It's a narrow government that is dominated by the Haqqanis, in which the Taliban who are involved in the negotiations in Doha, the original Kandahari leadership, have been marginalized, relegated to deputy positions like Mullah Brother and so on. And there's considerable resentment among those people, but that resentment will not lead to a split because that's against Taliban practices. But as far as political representation of others, it is completely lacking. That is, it's a government which is, even although the Taliban managed to overcome the ethnic divide to some extent by mobilizing fighters in the north of Afghanistan among Tajiks and Uzbeks, there's no sign that this has been translated into representation in their leadership. They're just a couple individuals, and it's as Pashtun a government as the previous one, and it even has 5 members of a single family. Namely the Haqqanis, who are all, of course, under sanctions. So this is something which is not going to be conducive to stability in the long run. It has led to discontent among the Taliban and discontent among the population. Now, let me cite exactly how that is going along. First of all, the Hazaras are being massacred systematically, not by the Taliban, but by the Islamic State, Khorasan province. Every Friday now, there's an explosion in some mosque where dozens of them are killed, Hazaras and Shia. And we saw under the Islamic Republic, when that was also happening, the Hazara and Shia population did not only blame ISKP, they also blamed the government for not protecting them. I am sure they will be doing that now, and it's inevitable that they will be taking measures to protect themselves if this kind of thing happens, and that Iran will be helping them take those measures to protect themselves. I don't know what form that will take. Next, I think this is even more ominous, is the condition of the Tajiks, which I think has not gotten enough attention. When the Islamic Republic regime started, the Tajik leaders were in a very powerful position. Actually, over time, those Tajik leaders lost a lot of their legitimacy among the Tajiks as they became rich, powerful, corrupt, like anyone else. But at least because they were there, the Tajik population has some access to employment and services and benefits from the government and so on. They were marginalized gradually over time, but now they are completely marginalized. And in fact, I had come to this conclusion myself independently, but I spoke to some Afghan Tajiks in Doha, where I was recently, who independently come to the same conclusion. The Tajiks in Afghanistan now are in a position analogous to the Sunnis in Iraq after the American invasion. That is, they have been completely swept out of power. And furthermore, the leaders that had claimed to be their leaders before are really not doing anything for them. That is, the resistance in Panjshir turned out to be relatively ineffective. Ahmed Massoud is widely respected, including among the Taliban, but he does not really have a movement. Amr al-Salah does not benefit from the same degree of respect. And what we are seeing now, something which I didn't predict, is increased recruitment of Tajiks into Daesh, into the Islamic State, which is the same thing that happened when there was ethnic exclusion in Iraq and a political vacuum. People from that ethnic group became extremists in order to fill that political vacuum. Recently, for instance, the Taliban broke up a cell of ISKP in Khairkhana, which, for those who know it, Khairkhana is a neighborhood of Kabul where Dr. Abdullah, Yunus Kanuni, and many other Tajiks live. It's the last place you would have expected to find that. And there are other signs as well. So I think that the combination of the economic crisis, the narrowness of the government, and let me say also a diplomatic vacuum is quite dangerous. So when I say diplomatic vacuum, it's not a complete diplomatic vacuum, but it's a vacuum of the United States. This week, Russia, last week, Pakistan convened a meeting of all the foreign ministers of the neighbors of Afghanistan on Zoom. Tomorrow, Russia will convene a senior officials meeting at the level of special representative of neighbors of Afghanistan and others in Moscow, and invited the United States, and the United States declined to come. And Iran wasn't going to come because the United States was there, but now that the United States is not coming, Iran is coming. Then next week, Iran is convening a foreign ministerial meeting of the neighbors of Afghanistan in Tehran, to which, of course, the United States is not invited. So, and we don't see the United States really engaging in that robust diplomatic engagement that President Biden spoke of. They did have some bilateral meetings with the Taliban over the last week. There were some meetings between the Taliban and the so-called like-minded group, US, Europe, and so on. But those were not focused on what the meetings in Moscow and Tehran will be focused on, which is the major need of Afghanistan right now, which is a political settlement. Afghanistan needs a political settlement now as much as it did before August 14th. And the Republicans, still, there are many people who sympathize with the benefits they had on the old regime, but there is no political platform for representatives of the Islamic Republic and what they represent to speak for themselves, speak for the people, or to engage the Taliban. So actually, even if the Taliban wanted to negotiate, and so far there aren't much signs that they do, there isn't someone for them to engage. And I believe the region is going to try to create something like that, a regional platform for engagement. But it's quite notable that the United States appears to be absent from that effort, which I think is unfortunate.
Thank you, Barney. To our panel, thank you for these outstanding presentations. We will now hear short interventions from our expert discussants. Our first discussant will be Prince Nader Naim. He is chairman of the board at the Kabul Institute for Peace. He's also a former presidential candidate and a grandson of the late King Zahir Shah. He joins us from Kabul.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon and good evening to all the participants of today's discussions and all the TRT world viewers. It's my pleasure to be among such a distinguished group of participants and speakers. Thank you so much for inviting me. From where I'm standing and observing the current environment here in Afghanistan, the Afghan people are facing a multitude of enormous challenges currently. The recent transition of power pretty much left our nation stunned and in disbelief. It feels that we've been living in an illusion for the past 2 decades. And now, the curtains have suddenly fallen and we are facing a bitter reality that was unimaginable only a few months ago. The billions of dollars that have been spent in Afghanistan seems to have vanished without making a sustainable impact on most of the Afghan people's lives. I think it'd be unfair to put the larger proportion of that blame that's currently facing us on the shoulders of the new power brokers in Kabul. I remember that when President Ashraf Ghani came into power in 2014, his aides were claiming that they inherited a bad government from the Karzai era. I think, to be fair, it's fair to say that the newly established Taliban government could have a much stronger claim to what the Ghani government and the US has left behind, which resulted in a total and unexpected collapse of the previous Afghan government in less than 2 weeks. I think that the American troops withdrawal was inevitable and was expected for a very long time. However, the way that it was conducted helped the rapid fall of the Ghani government, as well as the horrific evacuation that followed. The images of people falling from the aeroplanes is something that will stay in the back of our minds for a very long time. The reasons for the failures of the past 2 decades are vast and discussions with multidimensional nature. I hope that some of the speakers will cover this. However, I'd like to focus more on the aftermath of the 2 decades of Afghanistan and what we're currently faced with. The Taliban's new Islamic Emirate bears the burden of a great responsibility towards the Afghan people right now. I cannot stress how dire and heartbreaking the current situation here in Afghanistan is, and how important it is for the new government to find ways in which to deal with the current humanitarian crisis, as well as the economic meltdown that has been caused by the unexpected transition of power here in Kabul. The negotiations are far more complicated now than the negotiations of the Doha settlement or agreement. The international donor community would want to see practical ways for the Islamic Republic to deliver upon its initial promises. Also, the international community must be sensitive not to corner the Taliban into isolation, and offer some more time for the for them to fulfill their promise and their side of the bargain, such as forming a more inclusive government. You see, in Afghanistan, history tends to repeat itself, so I think we should learn from the past mistake, and this is a very important point that I just made. The sudden Afghan economy meltdown should not come as a surprise, of course, because the country was so totally dependent on international aid for almost 80% of its expenditure. So almost overnight, it came to a halt. And needless to say, on top of that, Afghanistan's 9.2 billion US dollars monetary assets have been frozen. The sad part is that this is a terrible price that the Afghan people as a nation are paying in hardship and despair. I'm witnessing that every day. In the old days, we had special places for secondhand material that people were selling. But now it's happening on every street in Kabul almost. One thing which is very interesting, and I know Barney has spoken about this in other occasions, and I want to remind people that the great division between the urban and the rural Afghanistan is quite apparent. It's almost now we are seeing a reverse of what was happening in the past 2 decades, in the sense that when I'm actually traveling quite freely around Afghanistan, and what I'm sensing is that rural Afghanistan is becoming more vibrant, and it's not as severely affected by the economic meltdown as Kabul is. Kabul right now is probably the most terrible place to be in, with all the job losses and the banks being shut, and there's no kind of sense of economy. which of course is very dangerous because this is actually pushing people, especially the kind of urban elite and the middle classes that my friend Saad was pointing to go out and seek a life outside this country. So this is very unfortunate, and I hope that this trend changes. The important thing is that as bad as the situation may be or seems to the outside world, I think we need to be very aware of it becoming worse, quite frankly, because Afghanistan still is quite a fragile state at the moment, and maybe, excuse me, in danger of turning into another Syria if the world turns its back on us again, and if Afghanistan sends, God forbid, back into a civil war. I think the likely outcome of it would possess not only danger to the region, but also to the world. So I think I'll stop at that.
Thank you, Prince Nader Naeem. Our next discussant is Mariam Wardak. Mariam is founder of Her Afghanistan, an organization dedicated to the advancement of young Muslim women. She was also an advisor to the former Afghan NSA. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tanya. It's wonderful to be on this panel. And I don't know what else I could add than what the distinguished panel members have just mentioned, but more so His Excellency Nader Naeem. I think he's put it very eloquently. So therefore, I would like to just highlight certain things that I'm paying attention to through Her Afghanistan and what our campaigns are going to be focused on. I think there needs to be a responsibility put on the international community, and the fact that we are not holding the UN as responsible for responding as quickly to the humanitarian crisis that has been taking place. The fact that some of us have been echoing for the past 2 years that as soon as there's going to be a military withdrawal, there will be an end to diplomatic ties and funding, and the international community very rarely address this issue. And lastly, the fact of the matter is they have been brought back into power with the assistance with one of the major superpowers, which is the United States. And the fact that the United States is not placing a framework on how we can address the following matters. The following matters is the humanitarian crisis, where they have subtly just placed it in the lap of the United Nations. The second aspect is availability to healthcare. Healthcare is also one of the major areas that are collapsing because of the funds freezing. And the third aspect is education for women. It seems that from what I've been observing and from what I'm hearing on the ground in Afghanistan, the Taliban seem to be echoing the fact that they have no problem with communicating with women. Again, I'm bringing the attention back to the international community because it seems that the international community continues to send delegates of all men, not placing any communication regarding women holding a dialogue on what women need in Afghanistan. I'm bringing responsibility to the international community because if we cannot hold them responsible, and they were the one that were pretty much the driving force on how Afghanistan was functioning for the past 2 decades, how can we hold the Taliban responsible for the next decade or so? And if we don't hold them responsible for this, the bear of this front, the Taliban will realize that the world community holds nobody responsible for their actions, and they will find that it's going to be a way to operate just as the 1990s. There are ground realities that many individuals are now returning back to their provinces, as His Excellency Nader Naeem mentioned. I know young girls are freely mobilizing and feeling comfortable, but they're also limited to the abilities of gaining any type of financial independence. One of the areas I want to bring attention to your viewers is that Afghanistan has slowly turned into a matriarch. What do I mean by a matriarch? Yes, we have a patriarchal system, but many of the households have lost many of the males. And women were the decision makers and the ones who were taking forward the economic infrastructure within their households. How are they going to bear the brunt of what's happening right now? I don't like focusing so much on Kabul because this is something that I've always spoken about for the past 10 years, that Kabul is not all of Afghanistan. And one of the reasons why Kabul has been shooken so badly is because the international community only focused on Kabul and very rarely focused outside of Kabul, which is why we're starting to see the revelation of many schools without proper infrastructures, more revelations of ghost soldiers, ghost teachers, etc. One thing that His Excellency Northern Naeem, again, I would like to echo what he says because I think he placed it very eloquently, is that we also need to hold we need to hold the past politicians responsible. And these are politicians that are in other countries taking dialogues on Afghanistan forward. And if we don't start holding them responsible and bringing them to any type of international courts for the commitments, the crimes that they've committed in Afghanistan, leading to what it is right now, because all of them bear the brunt of what's happening to the Afghan people right now. On what we can do moving forward, Her Afghanistan is very, very concerned on the kind of narrative that the Taliban are taking forward. The Taliban have fought this battle on the Islamic values. However, there seems to be a misconception, and there's different camps, as Barnett Rubin mentioned, within the Taliban. You have the liberal aspect, ones who want women to be educated, and then you have the hardcore Haqqanis who are very negative on how they want the women to function within society. And the best way to move forward is to educate them on their own language, which is religion. We've come together with a few Islamic scholars around the world, females, and we're going to start a national campaign, which will include boards, which will include online campaigns on how women could be active within society. And this will not only include verses, but hadiths when the verses were revealed and what the meaning is and how it's supposed to be adapted in today's time. And why is this important? Because no matter how many intellectual conversations we have around the Taliban and in Afghanistan, if we don't understand how to use the religion in the conversations, it will not be able to influence the Taliban in any way. Lastly, the international community has a power within their hand to be able to influence the Taliban, not to influence them and push them into a corner where they're going to eventually enter the drug industry again because of the devastation the Afghan people are in, but the fact that they can use the financial funds as a carrot on the stick. The Taliban are, in certain segments, are brutal, but then certain segments are not. We also have to understand that these are men who very rarely know how to associate with women who are progressive. But we also need to understand that men in Afghanistan, whether they were Taliban or not, will also very negative towards the women uprising within society. There is misogyny within our society, within our culture, and we have to understand that that is not the mentality of only the Taliban, but with the society as a whole. Something that we have to try to challenge step by step. Lastly, I'm very concerned about the type of demonstrations that women are a part of throughout Afghanistan that I see on social media. There have been information from some of my members on the ground that certain international organizations or outlets have reached out to them and say, hey, if you hold a demonstration and you provide us with some clips, we can possibly help you evacuate you from Afghanistan. That's extremely dangerous. Again, it's international community that's engaging with the nationals and putting their lives at risk at such a sensitive moment. We have to be very cautious of what we see online, question it, and make sure that we are able to minimize disinformation and fake news very quickly. And also keep the public in Afghanistan on the ground aware that we are here to listen to what you have to say, and we will help echo your voices, but through a mechanism that will not put your lives in danger. Democracy was something that took place within the past 2 decades, but the Emirates is not going to accept a democracy, and they've made that very clear. And for what's really important to me is the safety of my women, because if these women are the women that have the minds that they've cultivated in the past 20 years, I don't want their lives to be at risk for a demonstration. And I want their minds to be used on helping the government potentially function for the future. Because Afghanistan will not be able to be sustainable and will not be able to function without the women. We do have women who have technically advanced in engineering, education, medicine, and other fields. And I don't want to take up more of the time. Thank you so much. If there's any questions, I'd like to hold a discussion after that.
Thank you, Mariam. Now let's bring in Ali Latifi. He's the last of our discussants. He's the well-respected Kabul correspondent for Al Jazeera English, an Afghan-American journalist who has been on the ground reporting for many years. And he joins us from Doha now. Ali?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Tanya. I really appreciate the chance to have this discussion. I'm glad to see Mariam. I'm glad to see Naeem Saib, two people that I respect very much, that I consider friends. So I just wanted to address a few points that have come up in the discussion so far. I think it is true that, at some point the world has to realize that they will have to engage with the Taliban because there is no other alternative. People, as Naeem Saib said, people were frustrated with the previous government even before the Taliban came into power. And you notice that in the sentiment on the streets in Kabul and in other cities and online, you don't really see anybody, calling for them to come back into power or longing for the days when, they were in charge of the government, because people really remember that time as being a time of increased corruption, as facing allegations of racism and ethnocentrism and, all kinds of other difficulties that didn't actually, it was supposed to be a government of quote unquote technocrats led by, this great thinker that really ended up creating the situation we're in right now. And how did it end with all of them running away? So many of them had second passports. So many of them had dubious qualifications and came under allegations of corruption and other sorts of crimes, including moral crimes that really they never had to stand on trial for, that they never had to answer for. So that government will be stained with that, especially once they, fled, once they all ran away. That stain will stay on them. It'll be very difficult for them to wash that away. But the other thing we have to remember is that the ground reality in Afghanistan is extremely complicated at the moment, because as much as the Taliban want to say they're bringing order, they're bringing security, they're bringing unity, the reality on the ground is very different. I myself have seen it, my friends have seen it, we've all seen it, where, a Talib leader will tell you any number of things and will try and reassure you. But on the ground, when you're dealing with the foot soldiers that they cannot control, it's quite a different situation. I mean, I had a friend whose brother was taken in the city of Mazar by the Taliban under false charges of, being part of the former military. Something very similar to what the Islamic Republic used to do for 20 years that led to all of these false imprisonments and abuse and torture and all of these things. The Taliban were doing the same. And when I reached out to people who were very close to the Taliban, their answer was, I'm in Kabul or I'm in Kandahar or wherever, and the Taliban in Mazar are a very different group. We have to acknowledge these things, that, it's not as if the Taliban are this magic, unit that have been working together, because if that was the truth, then why do we keep having these issues on the streets, where we see journalists being locked up and tortured and abused, where we see women just afraid to go out? Yes, many have tried to return to work and have returned to daily life in different ways, but a lot of them are just very afraid to go out on the street because they themselves don't know how a Talib will react to them. You have young men who have the same problem. So, these are things that the Taliban will have to address, in terms of saying, well, we need to start rebuilding the nation. We do. But part of the problem is that there's really nobody in the Taliban leadership that has the capacity to actually run a Ministry of Finance or to rebuild a building. They know how to destroy one, but do they know how to rebuild one? And this is why the idea of an inclusive government is so important, because you have these people who have been educated, who have these experiences, who know these things, that need to come in and be brought into the system. I mean, I just did a report on judges in the country. Male and female judges are currently on the run because thousands of prisoners were freed, in the lead up to the Taliban takeover. And those prisoners promised revenge. Now, whether or not they will actually take it out is one thing, but that fear is there. And at the same time, they're not being called back to duty. So who is really running the court system right now? Who is making these decisions? Is this how we end up with a situation like Daikundi, where, you know, people are being told to get out of their house because it's, you know, the people's property, or a shura has decided that, this should become the people's property, or that there's a land dispute or something, where this is not, you know, one village, not two villages. This is what, 10, 20 villages, hundreds and hundreds of families, where you have the same issue in Kandahar, you have the same issue in Herat, you have the same issue in Kabul. So these are all things that that the Taliban needs to get real about and address. And when people say an inclusive government, this is what they mean. I mean, going back to Mariam's point about, and it's very true that women are the breadwinners in so many families, but so many women are not allowed to go back to work, right? They're either told, go bring your male relative to collect your money, or they're just turned away at the door. Yes, some have returned to work for sure. Some teachers, some doctors have, but a lot of others haven't. And so we have to, you know, address these actual ground realities. And we have to make sure that the Taliban, you know, at some point wake up. When they say, what is the point of having a female in the government? Well, then what hope does a little girl who may eventually, a teenage girl, eventually be allowed to return to school? Well, what hope does she have of studying? Why would she go, you know, to finish her high school diploma when she can, you know, return to school, then go to university, if they tell her, well, you can't do this and you can't do this and you can't do that, you know? So we really, really have to, this has always been the problem. We didn't address the realities of the 20 years of occupation, you know, which as Naeem Saib said, was like a dream, and it really was, because, you know, there were plenty of people within Kabul who didn't gain very much from it. And the reason why we see, you know, people in rural areas feeling like their lives haven't been as disrupted, because the reality is, if any of us who have been in the rural areas over the last 20 years, they didn't get anything from the last 20 years of occupation. They didn't get to vote, they didn't get hospitals, they didn't get roads, they didn't get any of these things. So to them, unfortunately, not much has changed. The Taliban were probably in power back then anyways. So, you know, I think this has become the major issue in Afghanistan, is that we never really want to talk about the actual realities and the lived experiences of the people. And now is an ideal time to both take the former governments to task and the current Islamic Emirate, to make sure that the Islamic Emirate doesn't repeat or make worse the mistakes of the Islamic Republic.
Thank you, Ali. Now let's move on to some questions. I will invoke the moderator's privilege and ask a question of each speaker and discussant. If our discussants have questions of their own, please press the raise hand button as we discussed earlier. Daoud, Abedi, my first question is to you. There have been reports of discord among the Taliban during the government formation process. Some of our speakers have referenced also the fact that the government appears to be dominated by one faction in particular. Cabinet's been announced, and it has been criticized for failing to honor a commitment to an inclusive, broad-based Taliban government. Can we expect that promised inclusivity to come about at any time?
To consider this is a caretaker government.
Whose connection?
Therefore, it is needed to be faced.
Let me ask a question of Sultan Barakat then. Sultan, you were intimately involved in the Afghan peace process. You continue to have conversations, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, with all parties across the spectrum in Afghanistan. What is the likelihood of Afghanistan becoming once again a proxy battlefield for regional nations, a safe haven for terrorism, or see a return to civil war?
Thank you, Tanya. Let me first maybe address the issue of inclusivity, going back to what you've asked of Abedi. My understanding is that the talks are still ongoing, and the interest remains there. There's a very clear understanding amongst the Taliban that no group, single group, has ever been able to hold Afghanistan together on their own, ever. And they understand this very, very well, and they're looking to building alliances. You know, inclusivity is one form. But where we differ, I think, is in the fine definition of what is meant by inclusivity. Is inclusivity about having individuals so that you tick the box that these people, we have Tajik, we have women, we have, or is it about representation? And how far will it go? And how far should they share in terms of ideology in relation to the government? I think my understanding so far is that the talks continue. And as Barney maybe said earlier, that the political settlement is still as needed today as it was on the 14th of August. They have to come to an understanding with some of the major political groups in the government. Now, it is also tempting to some to try it alone, to try to go alone and to press ahead and to continue having now succeeded in gaining power, that they may want to try and go all the way under the flag of the emirate. But that is not the mainstream across the movement as I understand it. And I think the majority would like to have a more inclusive arrangement. Now, in terms of it becoming a ground for terrorist activities, I personally hope that Afghanistan will be taken out of this discourse altogether. I think Afghanistan and the Afghans have suffered a lot of something that wasn't even of their making. Al-Qaeda, this whole association, the thousands of people who were killed unfairly and for no reason is enough. And it'd be a big mistake to allow Afghanistan to go back into this game. And I understand from some superpowers' perspective, they can only mobilize resources when they identify an enemy. And terrorism is a very convenient identification. We know that the Taliban have committed to not allow terrorist groups to operate from within the territories of Afghanistan. And that is in the 2020 agreement with the United States. But suddenly now the goalposts have changed. They are not asked only to not allow or to ensure that the land is not used for counterterrorism. The world, and America in particular, is now seeking them to publicly denounce Al-Qaeda, submit Al-Qaeda, doing all sorts of things that were not part of the talks when they reached the agreement. And I think shifting those goals or giving them a vague, general, broad goal is not very helpful. I think it is important that these goals needs to be broken into some tangible, achievable targets and has to be communicated. And the only way for it to be communicated is for dialogue to continue. At the moment, this gridlock in terms of discussion is not taking anyone anywhere. And you could see this pride politics playing out as we heard earlier, the United States refusing to go to the meeting in Russia, Iran is coming in, India is playing a role, everybody is playing a role in this. And the ultimate price is being paid by the Afghan people. So it is really about time, and I hope the Taliban are watching and are listening to this and are following our discussions, that they must do their effort, their best to really neutralize Afghanistan from this global game on terror, because it's simply not worth it. You know, the Chinese are wanting to be involved in order to protect China from few thousand militants who may or may not, or have not so far done major infringes into China. And Pakistan is worried about the Pakistan Taliban and all these stories that goes on and on and on and leads them nowhere. But unfortunately, because of the situation at the moment, the risk remains high that they will get sucked into this discussion, whether they wanted it or not. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that they need to have the capacity to deal with all of this. You know, it's not enough to commit to counterterrorism. At the same time, you know, they freed all these prisoners, including some of terrorists and Daesh who've come back now to bite them. They have to have the actual on the ground capacity. And we go back to the same point about whether the revenue of the state is sufficient to do all this. We all know it's not sufficient. And it was not being done perfectly before with a lot of support. So how do you expect them in a few weeks to meet all those targets without the resources the previous government have had? So yeah, I may be repeating myself now, but I think there is a real danger, but the discourse should really change entirely. And this is the opportunity and for all Afghans, including the Taliban, they must really take the country out of this discussion on terrorism. They must do their very best to stop being a proxy game in this subject.
Barney, my next question is for you, and I think it's certainly the elephant in the room. You spoke of the Tajiks being like the Sunnis of Iraq. So this is a situation the Americans have seen before. How, in your view, did the US get it so wrong in the 20 years of operations, in the negotiations, and in the chaotic departure? How did it get it so wrong?
Well, I do have an answer for that question. I'm not sure it fits in this format, and it won't directly respond to the question about the current political exclusion of Tajiks. The United States did not do that. But look, in my view, let's just put it this way. Go back to Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist. He said, know your enemy, know yourself. Well, I think the United States failed on both of those counts. It didn't understand that the Taliban are part of Afghan society and are not the same as Al-Qaeda. It didn't understand how poor Afghanistan was, that you cannot extend the writ of the Afghan central government into the villages of the country. It's never done that. It does not have the capacity for that. That just generates more insurgency. You have to make political agreements with the local authorities in all of those areas. And the Taliban managed instead to intimidate them or negotiate with them. You can't pursue a policy in a landlocked country that the neighbor on whom you are relying for access thinks is against his interests, because we were pursuing policies in Afghanistan that were against the interests of Pakistan, which is fine. I believe they were right policies. But at the same time, we were relying on Pakistan for all of our access to Afghanistan. So we didn't, and we were unwilling to change our policy towards, say, Iran in such a way that would have balanced Pakistan, and many, many other things. As for knowing ourselves, I think that the Americans have not adjusted to the fact that the balance of power in the world has changed. During the 20 years that they were in Afghanistan, the ratio of the GDP of China to that of the United States has tripled. And that area is very far from the United States. And the United States cannot do these things unilaterally in Afghanistan. It doesn't have the capacity to change a society that it doesn't understand. And its force and money simply are not enough. So we saw that, of course, when the force and money is applied, there is an effect. You get an army. But when it's an army that cannot operate by itself in Afghanistan because it relies on American technology, which the Taliban did not, which previous Afghan armies did not. So I think that's just a very brief summary of how the United States got it wrong over quite a long period of time.
Thank you for that. Mr. Abedi, I'd like to come back to you because I think your connection is back up. Sultan touched on this, on the idea of inclusivity and how there seems to be no consensus over the definition of what would constitute an inclusive government. And of course, the Taliban has come under a great deal of criticism for up till now not forming an inclusive broad-based government, and also on many of its policies. How would you respond to this criticism? And how would you define inclusivity?
Thank you for the question. I must say this, that inclusivity by profession is a good thing to have. But nowhere in the world, even in the United States, we don't have inclusivity by tribes and by languages and by beliefs. Let's not forget that today's government in Afghanistan, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, is a caretaker government, and this is going to be changed to a permanent or at least 5 to 10 years, whatever years, government after a new constitution is formed. In regards to inclusivity of women and other tribes, we must say that woman is has as equal rights as men in Islam, and I'm sure 100% that they will allow, and they have already started allowing them working in the government in different sectors. Education, the same thing in 5 provinces of Afghanistan. Women education has already started, and they are working toward the other parts of the government, other parts of the country to have women continue their education. But also there was a point that there is different fractions inside the Taliban. That is not the case. That case has been made in the past 20 years, but as we saw, even though a lot of enemies of Afghanistan invested in this regard so much money to kind of show that there is 2-3 groups inside the Taliban or inside the Emirate of Islamic Afghanistan, which is not absolutely true. I'm in contact with the Haqqani brothers from almost 39 years ago, 40 years ago, with the father of Khalifa Sirajuddin Haqqani, Maulay Sayyid Jalaluddin Haqqani. I have met with them face to face with them, and I have in contact with all of them. I have never heard from them that they say we are separate and Islamic Emirate is separate. It is just that they are qualified. They were the people fighting occupation in the past 20 years. Today, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan must create its governmental structure. Once this structure is fixed, now there is one leadership. If they bring different views into the government right now, they will have to continuously negotiate, talk, and trust people that they don't know. Let's not forget that they have come from the fighting period. They don't know all members of a society, who is good, who is bad. This will give them the time to know the people, know the professionals who can do the job, and the government that it's into making. All of these people will be inclusive into them, because that's what they have been told to us. That's what we have addressed, and they have told us this.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Prince Nader Naim, the fighting is over, but the Afghan people seem to be marginalized in the national discourse and decision-making. I know that your institute, the Kabul Institute for Peace, has conducted a number of jirgas across the country in districts that are difficult to reach. Is this the peace that the people of Afghanistan were seeking?
Well, for the past 4 decades of wars and failures in Afghanistan, we have one important common denominator that's often overlooked, besides our bitter experiences of non-compatible types of government structures and bad governance. I think what is predominantly forgotten and overlooked is that for most parts, what the Afghan people wanted has never been taken into consideration. And ironically, the downfall of every regime since 1978 has had some form of effect from that aspect. You will find that this is one of the reasons for their downfalls. In fact, the last Afghan government of Ashraf Ghani was no exception to this. The rise of the Taliban in 2006 and 2007 was directly linked to the shortcomings of both President Karzai's government and its main backer, the US. This trend sadly continued and got worse during the government of Ashraf Ghani. We watched the security situation getting worse from a year end to year end. And ironically, I remember that every single year that passed, the American generals, or the NATO generals rather, would be saying that this is the decisive year for the war in Afghanistan. By the time that we conducted the countrywide community jirga programs covering all 7 zones of Afghanistan, in fact, earlier this year, 3 important things became very clear. Number one, that the Afghan people stopped believing in the Doha process, as they felt that there was a lack of real desire from the 2 negotiating sides to reach a real peaceful agreement. And they were feeling that the peace process is going painfully slowly. And number 2 is that they felt that they were not represented in any way by the group of the Afghan elites who were representing them in the peace process and the Doha talks with the Taliban. Women were particularly concerned about their rights being protected. And the most interesting, I think, aspect of it was the fact that we certainly had a consensus amongst most Afghan people about an end to the war and also a political settlement. Where the fault lines was actually with the leadership in Afghanistan. Years passed and they could not come to a single united platform with a vision for peace for Afghanistan. And unfortunately, we saw the result of that. And this was a kind of a really important reason for their downfall and the Taliban takeover. We are certainly experiencing, if to answer your question, has the Afghan people got the peace that they wanted? I think that, we are experiencing, as some of our speakers mentioned earlier, that the end to the heavy war has happened, whereby we used to have an average of 150 to 200 people lives being lost every single day. And apart from the heinous recent attacks on the Shia mosque in Kunduz and Kandahar, Afghanistan has been really relatively peaceful and secure since the Taliban takeover. But the real peace is not just the end of war. From the discussion that we had in our community jirga programs, people wanted a just peace, whereby the rights of all the citizens were protected, especially that of the women. I hope that we will get to a real and unjust peace soon, as the Afghan people have suffered for far too long.
Thank you for that. Ali, I'd like to ask you one question. You've been on the ground for years and watched the media get it right and get it wrong. What about now? Is the mainstream media missing out or getting it right?
I think, as with any other period in Afghan history, the Islamic Emirates is a very complicated situation. And I think that we have a tendency to either paint it as overly grim or surprisingly positive. And I think the reality is that we're somewhere in the middle. There is still a lot, as I said, this disunity can be felt on the ground by the people, in your daily interactions with the Talib. Some will be very nice to you, will leave you alone, won't say anything to you. Others will be extremely hostile. Others will get violent. Others will take your property. And, these things need to be addressed and these things need to be highlighted. But one of the problems with the media landscape in Afghanistan currently is that it's less free than it was under the Islamic Republic. And there was a lot of difficulties operating under the Islamic Republic, but it's even less free now than it was then. Just the way the Taliban operate, you're not sure what you can report, I myself have been in places where basically I've been told that, you know, your camera will be broken, that, you know, I've been told by Taliban members that, you know, journalists need to learn their place and they need to stay within a certain role. And you know, we've seen so many, I mean, Saad Mohseni is no longer in this conversation, but we've seen so many Afghan journalists leave the country because they do not feel safe to operate. You know, and not only do they not feel safe to operate, they also don't know if they can properly operate. You know, can you go to, you know, a lot of foreign journalists are excited because for the first time they're going to Wardak and Ghazni and Logar and so on and so forth. But, you know, is that really valuable when you're going with a Taliban convoy? Or when you're going to meet a Taliban representative who will then somehow guide you through that, you know, through that province or that area? Is that really still journalism? Because, you know, in the past, under the Islamic Republic, as I said, there were many, many difficulties operating as a journalist. But for the most part, you know, I could get in a car, I could go to Wardak, come back the next day, write my story, and, you know, if I face the consequence, I face the consequence. But it wasn't that difficult. The main difficulty was the security, and who was causing that security challenge? Usually the Taliban. So, you know, now the question is, can you still do that? You know, or do you have to go through all of these layers of, you know, sort of, and the other thing is, you know, like someone like a Zabiullah Mujahid will tell, oh, you have no problem, do what you want, no one will stop you. But then when you get on the ground, even if you're trying to say, get into the Kabul airport to report, you could have a letter from Zabiullah, which I did, and then they'll say, no, 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 go away. Or you could be told that covering a protest is illegal, then beaten and tortured in jail in the middle of the city of Kabul, which nobody has paid a price for yet. Right?
Okay. I can see that Nader Naeem would like to speak. We have 3 minutes before we get cut off. So if you could share your thoughts before we have to sign off.
Thank you very much. We were hoping to ask some questions as well. This is what you promised us. So I'm going to go right ahead and ask a question from Barney Rubin, because he raised something very important. He spoke about a political settlement. Now, Barney, in your thoughts and in your mind's eye, how would that look, and what kind of mechanism do you think that could entail? And number two is that what would it take for the Islamic Emirates to be recognized by the Western world?
Well, in the little time we have, of course, let me see. Yeah, I think that I can't really answer that. First, a political settlement would mean, first of all, I think no one in the opposition right now is talking about taking power away from the Taliban, trying to change the government. That's just not realistic. But they need to have some organized voice and to have a role in deciding on some key policies, which they don't now. That can evolve over time. As far as criteria for recognition, I think it's off the table right now for virtually everyone, and no one has set up clear criteria for recognition. And I think that's good, because if they did, then the Taliban would try to meet them, and then when they did, they still wouldn't be recognized. So it's better to let the situation evolve until there is more understanding and comfort on both sides about what recognition entails.
Thank you.
We've got 2 minutes. Does anyone else have another question?
Tanya, if I may.
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
I think we're in a situation of sort of a classic glass of half full or half empty. And we really need to look at the moment onto the half full glass and see how we can make it work. Spitting into this glass is not going to work. It's going to make it much worse situation. And the biggest opportunity, to my mind, is the Taliban declaration of an end of war. The end of war is something that the whole world should capitalize on. It also means the end of jihad. It also means rolling back all the emergency laws and the circumstances under which they've justified a lot of their actions in the past, including against women, freedom of expression, media. I remember the days when they used to hang the TV sets. I don't know if some of you were there in those dates. and fighting the media. Videos were haram, TV was haram. Now they're the best actors on social media. So I think we really need to capitalize on this, the end of war, the end of violence, and take it as the foundation to hopefully together build a better Afghanistan. No one is going to do it for the Afghans. No amount of international aid is ever going to do it. And I often say to my friends here that they should look at the sanctions as an opportunity rather than as a loss. It's an opportunity for them to think afresh, to organize their home, to get their act together before they get flooded by international assistance. Otherwise, the moment Afghanistan goes into this international aid trap, it's stuck for many, many years to come. Thank you.
Thank you. Sadly, we are coming to the end of our session. I think we can all agree that the next 12 months will be a momentous time in Afghanistan. And we must all hope and pray, as you said, that it will be for the better. On behalf of TRT World Forum, I want to thank our speakers, our discussants, and our audience for their time today. Thank you again, and best regards from Istanbul.
Thank you for having us.